Witness the shocking tale of the Nazis, a famous artist, and Mr. Han van Meegeren. In 1936, a new painting was discovered, previously lost to history by the Dutch master painter Johan Vermeer. It was called The Supper at Emmaus. It was discovered by a Mr. Han van Meegeren, who got rather a lot of money for it. In the following years, Van Meegeren uncovered a number of other paintings by Vermeer and other artists, and managed to sell them for about $30 million in today's modern currency. He used this money to finance a luxurious lifestyle. But in 1940, the tiny Netherlands were occupied by the forces of the Third Reich. During the occupation, another painting by Vermeer, Christ with the Adulteress, also discovered by Van Meegeren, was sold to a Nazi banker, and then found its way into the possession of Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, Hitler's right-hand man. After the war, the painting was discovered by Allied forces amongst Göring's possessions and traced back to Van Meegeren. Van Meegeren was charged with selling this incredibly valuable piece of Dutch cultural property by one of the Netherlands' greatest artists to the enemy. The penalties for collaborating with the Nazis were severe.
And then came the shocking confession. The painting wasn't by Vermeer. It was by Van Meegeren. It was a forgery. They were all forgeries. Even Supper at Emmaus, which experts had said was Vermeer's greatest work, was actually by Van Meegeren. The whole time he'd been trolling everybody to the tune of $30 million. Van Meegeren was himself a painter, but critics had called his work derivative and unoriginal, so he had set out to prove to them that he was as good as Vermeer. He spent 6 years perfecting his forging techniques, and when he was ready, he unveiled the lost Vermeers to the world. They were so good that some critics refused to believe that he did it when this all came to light. They said he's just trying to get out of going to prison for collaborating with the Nazis, until he proved it by painting one in court. So art critics were faced with a peculiar philosophical dilemma. Once they knew that the Van Meegeren works were forgeries, they could either say, yes, these are still great works of art, or say that the fact that they were forgeries meant that they were aesthetically cheapened somehow. So does a forgery have less aesthetic value than an original? Obviously this is going to depend in part on how you define aesthetic value, but we can just use a folk concept of it for now. The value that a work of art has in virtue of its being a work of art. The obvious problem with saying that a work of art is aesthetically worth less when it's a forgery is that it can look exactly the same. If I were to make a copy of the Mona Lisa, then alright, it wasn't painted by Da Vinci, but if it's a perfect copy and the Mona Lisa is beautiful, then my copy must surely still be beautiful as well. Van Meegeren's works can still be beautiful and moving and all the rest of it despite being forgeries, so what's the problem? Alfred Lessing uses this point to say that our concern with forgeries is basically just snobbery. The art world might say that a forgery is financially worth less than an original, but that's because the art world is concerned with things like historical and social value rather than what they should be concerned with, which is how good the work of art is. He considers that forgery might be morally bad, it does involve deception after all, but in order for artistic forgery to be bad specifically, we'd have to be substituting an inferior product for the real thing, and we haven't yet established that forgery is an inferior product. Now, Van Meegeren might have lied, and he might have profited from lying and profited from the Nazis, and those could be bad things to do, but that doesn't mean that the work itself is made worse in virtue of being a forgery. Dennis Dutton isn't happy with this. He says that a forgery is aesthetically worth less than an original, even a so-called original forgery like Supper at Emmaus, which was an original work by Van Meegeren, but just in the style of Vermeer. He thinks that part of aesthetic appreciation is appreciating the achievement that a work of art represents. Vermeer was painting with 17th century techniques and 17th century materials and practices, and he contributed something new to the history of painting, and it represents a significant achievement because of that. Whereas Van Meegeren was operating with completely different parameters, he didn't have the same limitations, he didn't contribute any new styles to the history of painting, so it's not as impressive an achievement. In fact, Dutton says he wasn't even doing art. What he was doing was forgery, which is a whole different kettle of fish, and his works might have forgery value, but they don't really have aesthetic value. What this debate basically comes down to is, what are you going to include under aesthetic value? In particular, are you going to include historical, relational properties, things like when the work of art was made, who made it, what came before, what came after, and so on? Dutton thinks that those things are important for deciding how good the art is. Lessing says they're not. He thinks that aesthetic value is narrower than artistic value. Artistic value is, if you like, the total actual value of a work of art, which might include things like creativity and historical relational properties and so on. But aesthetic value is narrower than that and is based on something like what it's like to experience the work of art. So a forgery can have the exact same aesthetic value as an original. I think certain types of art actually support Lessing's position. For instance, appropriation art. Appropriation art is when an artist takes part or all of an existing work, copies it, and presents it as their own. So for instance, there's a famous series of photographs by an artist called Walker Evans. In the 1980s, an appropriation artist called Sherry Levine took the photos, copied them, like she didn't just take similar photos or anything, she actually just copied Walker Evans' work and represented it as a new work called After Walker Evans. Now, assuming that that is art, which might be a little bit controversial, I think that After Walker Evans must have the same aesthetic value as Walker Evans' original photos because they look exactly the same. But we might nevertheless want to say that they have different artistic values because they're two different works of art trying to say two very different things. Personally, I'm more on Lessing's side here. In particular, this distinction between aesthetic and artistic value is something that I've developed in my own research at university for various technical reasons that we don't need to go into. Perhaps Lessing's support would have been comforting to Han van Meegeren. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison for fraud, but allowed to go free around his neighbourhood before the sentence began because his health was poor. He maintained throughout the trial that he wasn't interested in the money, he just wanted to show his critics that he was as good as Vermeer. He even became something of a cultural hero, the painter who trolled the Nazis. He died of a heart attack at the age of 58, having never begun his prison sentence. What do you guys think? Is a forgery aesthetically worth less than an original? Do historical relational properties count? Was Van Meegeren as good an artist as Vermeer? By the way, if you're interested in the details of Van Meegeren's story, there's a free link in the description to a 12-minute short film about him and his work. And if you're interested in the details of philosophical stories, then for more philosophical videos every Friday, please do subscribe. In 2 weeks' time, when the next full episode would be, I'm going to be graduating from university because I have now finished my degree. So there's going to be a very, very special video next time. So do stay tuned for that. This episode was paid for on Patreon by Intimidating Scones, DJ MacIsaac, Rich Clarke, and a bunch of other people whose names are in the description. So thank you to everybody who supports the show on Patreon. If you'd like to support it on Patreon, then I'm now unemployed, so I would really, really appreciate that. So you can find a link to my Patreon down there as well. Last time we asked, should you save the greatest number of people? So let's see what you guys had to say. By putting on this hat, I'm going to be occupying the position of John Torek, the philosopher who says that you don't have to save the greatest number, because a lot of people were criticising him in the comments last time. So Distraction Donkey, Bryn Walker and James Morgan said that saving 5 people rather than 1 minimises the amount of suffering in the world. No, it doesn't, because you can't sum that suffering together. Everybody suffers 1 death, nobody suffers 5 deaths. MOH said that human life isn't valuable because it's important to you, it's valuable because it's important to other people, the people who have it. Well, yeah, but again, you can't sum that value together. So if the life of the 1 means more to you, then you can save the 1 rather than the 5. William Braille also said that the moral decision is the decision which minimises suffering, but again, you can't sum the suffering together. Nobody suffers 5 deaths. Now, you said that we should occupy the position of society, but what is society apart from the individuals that make it up? That society doesn't suffer apart from people suffering, and the same goes for you, Shangori, and you, Kyle Davis. You see, Torek's ideas are actually a lot more powerful than some people give them credit for. You know, in order to prove Torek wrong, you've really got to be able to do a lot of work. I'll take this off now and I'll just be myself. David Munn and a few other people said that we need to take into account the economic value of people. So 5 people working hard and paying taxes will contribute more good to the economy than 1 person doing that, so we should save the 5 rather than the 1. Yeah, but again, Torek's going to say you can't sum the good that they do. So if you, the decider, stand to lose more by the 1 dying than anybody individually in society stands to gain from the 5 surviving, then you can still choose to save the 1. It was interesting to see how many people in the comments seemed to treat the health of the economy as an intrinsic good as well. That's something that the current British government arguably seem to do as well. They seem to say that the economy being healthy is something that is good in itself, rather than something that is good only insofar as it puts money into the pockets of the people who actually need it. A few people got a little bit confused and said, well, what if the 1 wants you to save the 5? What if the minority wants you to save the majority? Well, yeah, in that scenario, there wouldn't actually be any conflict there, so we could resolve that fairly easily, but Torek just needs to say that it's possible that the 1 could want to save themselves in order for his argument to work. He doesn't need to say that people always want to save themselves or that everybody is selfish. Some people seem to think that he was committed to egoism or started with egoism. He doesn't actually need to do that, and he doesn't mention it. All that he needs is for that circumstance to be possible in order to set up the question, okay, what do we do now? Do we save the majority or the 1 person? What's the right thing to do? What are we obliged to do? And so on. That's all the time we've got this week. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next episode when I graduate. Bye! You see, I don't look that big or tall or broad on camera, but just to give you an idea, this hat would probably fit like a normal-sized person. And then that I can see it on the camera. Like that is how big that's how big I am.